Tucker always hangs around.
I want to reunite families.
But that's not for you alone.
Well, there was a small grant. Like
Yes.
It's my only goal in life.
Why not a llama instead of an alpaca?
Llamas and alpacas have really soft fur and makes nice sweaters.
They're very fluffy.
So that's why.
Yes.
Sweet. She takes pictures.
Talk about Zoe's dream farm or backyard farm animals.
It'll be a farm. Eventually, be patient. That's all.
Because fall she teaches something. She's doing
I think we
quite
got
a
to
few things. She does it in
Alpacas,
education
all
and
that.
innovation.
Yeah, alpacas and cows. And then whatever else I want. Rescue. Rabbits are kind of a pain. I used to have them. And
A house
I
buddy.
ate everything.
Yeah. How about the giant ones that size of like a 5-year-old kid?
Those are cool. My friend wants to get one. She has a
started
farm.
school, she was already
She's gonna
finishing
trade for one of those.
Giant rabbits.
Yes. They're so cute.
Because I started
Enormous. They're so big.
We had a house buddy, but it was not that big.
I had a mini Rex. So.
Ours was supposed to be a mini Rex, but we think it was a cross because it was the size of a regular Rex, but his ears were like this short. He was special.
That's like my cat.
Yeah, we got him from this girl, and her nephew had really bad untreated ADHD, so the poor thing was just not having a good time. So we took it. So she did not like being picked up, but she would like snuggle with you. She used to chase our Shih Tzu around, and it was good. But yeah, she was special.
It was pretty quick between.
Yeah, I'd like to chase my cat.
She already
But
finished.
then my cat, one cat.
So it's still saving.
Yeah, she also used to get we put the hamster in the ball, and the hamster would chase her. And it was good times.
One having kids. Now I just have to. I want another dog. I have a bad problem with animals.
We don't have any right now. It's,
Oh my god, I would
well,
die.
our guinea pig died in July,
Yeah, about.
and so we haven't gotten a new anything because we can't have cats dogs in our apartment. So I just haven't been able to stand the thought of getting it. And our hamster died like
I hope so.
6 or 7 months before that. So we just haven't gotten another, but it's sad that we know it's fluffy thing in the house, and it's very sad.
I'd be so, I wouldn't function at all.
It's not good. It's not good.
Yeah, I really want another dog right now because my dog gets so bored with me. Something to like play with. He tries to play with my cats, but it's just not like it's me. They don't play the same way.
We only had the one guinea pig because we adopted it, we rescued it from somebody, he had never been around other guinea pigs, so it wouldn't have been pretty. But we're thinking we might get 2 baby guinea pigs this summer. Because I want to get her like one of those big build your own cage things and have like the craziness. So I gotta wait till I have some money, but we're thinking about trying to find some babies. Because all of our animals have been damn near grown because we rescue them from people, but we want a baby for once. Because our last hamster, we got it. We don't usually get animals for pets first, but we got our last hamster from Petco. Because we went in to pick up hay, and she only had 1 ear, and I lost it. I was like, the baby only has 1 ear. And we had to take her home, and she was awesome, but she did just that's so weird. Like, I have to take her home. Moral imperative, get me a clerk.
Yeah, I can't be around animals that like need help because they'll just like
That's why my wife is not allowed to volunteer at the Humane Society.
My mom,
She can come up with things.
I've always wanted to do it, but or like
I guess maybe I should start.
I'm thinking foster. I was just like, I just couldn't do it.
Minutes, okay.
No, 1 minute.
But we can get you started.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't know, I don't wanna rush it, but at some point in time.
Yeah,
I didn't realize this is right before spring break.
Yeah, I wondered, I thought, he chose the day before spring break, why did he do that?
Because those guys months.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm sure you know everybody in the room, right? Do you know?
Fairly well.
Okay.
Some people more so than others.
Well, Okay, good. Well, go ahead and get started.
Hi, I'm Tim Kanke. Oh, I'm supposed to hit start on this thing. There's more.
Record.
Oh, is it already? It's already recording. We got all that fun stuff ahead of time. So I'm Tim Kanke. Today I'm going to talk about a fellowship I did with the DPLA and the LEADS program through Drexel, analyzing subject metadata and large-scale aggregated digital libraries. Fancy way of saying I was looking at subject terms that they have. Okay. So the overview, so if people are keeping track of where I'm at in the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Digital Public Library of America is. It'll be acronymed as DPLA here on out. Project scope of the actual tasks I was doing. A little bit about the DPLA data set. What I was discovering about their subject terms in a broad sense. Then bringing in the concepts of external control vocabularies to try to figure out what's happening with their the actual subject terms that are being used. A little bit about the method, which is the meat of the project itself. And then moving into, it's more of a forward thinking and also my research interests about Wikidata and how their controlled vocabulary is represented. This is just a cursory look into that can be a much larger study. So the Digital Public Library of America, it connects all the digital resources from any of the archives, museums, libraries, cultural heritage institutions. There's 42 currently hubs or data providers. They're providing some of their records, and so it's a nice clearinghouse. So if you're looking for any kind of digital information, dp.la is a great place to discover items. Of course, with that many people providing data, every institution has their own in-house version of how they need to catalog out their items. And then within that, each of the collections might require a different kind of concepts on how you need to catalog those items to best serve the community that you're having. So having such a large data set, because it has more than 22 million items, actually it might be a little bit more. They just added a couple more people, but the data set I was working with had 22 million items. The types of materials, it's across the board. It's photographs, it's books. They have video clips of like newscasts. So if you want to know about Socks the Cat and the Bill Clinton administration, there's a link so you can go and watch that and discover that sort of information easily. It's also personal letters. Anything you find in an archive that's been digitized and that they're willing to share from those institutions, they make it available. So the project scope is I initially looked at it and realized that there was at least 3 million unique subject tags within this collection. So this is the massive size of that. So of course then there's like slight variations of terms. There could also be like maybe some sort of machine or person error as far as maybe variations in spelling or like a misspell. Then there's also synonyms for the same concept. So that's the general issue they were having was the recall of information. So if somebody's typing in their search and looking at subject terms, they might not be getting all the results that they should because it might not have a mapping between the different terms. So it was quite the list. You ask for the sky and then you get something in return. So they wanted to be able to match the terms to existing controlled vocabularies, and then in the eventual thing to encourage consistent vocabulary use. So most people are using certain controlled vocabularies to encourage and promote the concept of those vocabularies being more useful for individuals actually trying to access the material to get the items. Reduce the vocabulary silos. You can't help that to a certain extent, especially with some specialized collections. They're going to have terms that are so specific that maybe have like one generalized term to help that out. Improve discovery of content for users, and then also the other last bullet point, which is important for the DPLA, is having it repeatable, because every couple of months they re-ingest the same metadata records from all their hubs, all 42 of them. to refresh and get new links to all the records. So it has to be something that can repeat on a general basis, and the more automated, the better. DPLA, it's actually moving, I think, to their third generation of how they have their databases. They've now moved to Apache Spark. And Apache Spark, it's an open source distributed general purpose cluster computing framework. So the important parts of those is open source, so it means that they're not locked in, and as long as there's somebody interested in the project, they can continue to use it into the foreseeable future. Of course, all software ages, so at some point in time, there'll probably be something that'll come up that we'll need to switch to, that'll be better. The more interesting is distributed, which allows them to speed up tasks. So it uses multiple processors instead of just doing a single processor type calculations. And then that's also helped out more with the clustering. So you can have multiple machines with multiple cores all running at the same time. So they had like one report that would take 2 days to run. And when they moved to this system, it took an hour to do the same exact report. So for them, it's a cost saving measure, both in time and also, compute power. It uses many different languages that you can use to interface with it. It's really a Java machine, but Scala is the one that the DPLA is mainly using. But I'm more familiar with Python, and so I'm mainly using the Python interface for that. And they have a special, this is just a little bit about the records. It was in the summer. They have a new data set that's been just released. So this stuff is just not as fresh as what it could be. So there's about 2/3 of the items have a subject heading, have at least one. And it sounds, from a cataloging standpoint, that sounds bad. Like to have 1/3 of your items not have a single subject heading. But for digital libraries, they're all about the long tail. So if you have something, a majority of them at least having a subject heading, and then some of them having multiple, then that's considered acceptable. That's a win. So the subject headings range can go from 1, and then there was one that had 1,331 subject headings, which I'll show you in a moment here. So this bar graph here, you can see that most of them were in the first 1 to 4 subject headings. If you follow Library of Congress rules, they have the rule of 3, and so you can see that most of them kind of fall into that. And then as you can see, there's the long tail that happens as it goes down. That last one's a bump up because that's the aggregating all of them that are 20 plus. But in reality, if I had the chart go off the screen, it just slowly goes off into infinity. So, and then the one that has, this was interesting. It's a cataloging. It was a phase of cataloging was really important. So let's see if I can make that a little bit bigger. The subjects we're starting off with. This document has to do with the race. How do they phrase that? Race relations in the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, and this document has reports, including police records of incidents that were happening. And so in general, at the beginning, you have they were throwing any kind of subject heading that would be pertinent to that. But then as you continue on down, it becomes, it's quite a scroll. Then it starts to become just people's names. So it was an idea that if anybody's name was just mentioned in the document, then it was be important to have as a subject heading. So if somebody's just doing research, say on L.E. Cole, and they wanted to be able to find all the documents that they're mentioned, they could actually do that. That's important if anybody's doing like genealogy research. So that's the reason why they've done that, and part of that's the restrictions of Dublin Core. They decided the subject field was the place to put it. But in looking at the concept of controlled vocabularies, this becomes, looks like more of an issue when you're looking at the raw numbers, because I'm not sure, but most of these people are probably not considered notable for Library of Congress because you have to have published an item to get into their name authority file. And it says some of the large data aggregate like Wikidata, you have to also follow their notability standards. And these people, although they participated in an event, they might not necessarily follow that criteria. So, looking at it a little bit more as I was going in, they did, the people at DPLA, this was this experience that was a little eye-opening to see what was actually going on with subject headings. Looked at the top 10 of them, and they make sense because there's a large plant collection. It's a digital public library in America, so the United States popping up a lot. This sort of makes sense. Texas is a big hub. There's a lot of records that they get from them. And then after that, this general category. So at least the top 10, they're what they would expect to have. So the next step was, after just looking at a general idea of what are the subject headings they have, was to find out what controlled vocabularies the hubs may be using. Did a really informal survey, just asked to get a feel of where to start. Because the obvious one to me was to use the Library of Congress subject headings and name authority file, having been a cataloger as a graduate student. The thesaurus and graphic materials I might not have thought of as much. Getty is very popular with many of the institutions as well, and starting to gain traction is OCLC's fast subject headings. But what I thought was interesting, but I didn't go into because of time, is the secondary ones. So some collections are important that have, they're both Canadian subject headings, mesh, which was understandable in there. But the one I thought was interesting was the Maori subject headings. It's a cultural group that needs specific subject headings just for them. But for what I'm going to talk about today and this project in general, we decided that although some of these subject headings, it's important to keep in mind that I might not have matched the terms correctly to a controlled vocabulary. It's possible that they've matches to one of these. So it's not an exhaustive search, it's just trying to get the large, low-hanging fruit and to get an idea of unifying things. So these are the 4 vocabularies, and just to give an idea, the most interesting one is the name authority file. Is 86 gigabyte download, which takes a little bit of time to get. From my parsing through it, I ended up getting around 10 million terms from that one, and those are the dates. Those are actually, Library of Congress now has brand new ones that came out, so I get to enjoy. I just downloaded that one the other day. So the general workflow for this that I conceptually thought about was to have the DPLA data, prepare it, they have it ready, and then also the controlled vocabulary. And I'm only doing this on my laptop, which is, it's not bad. It's a 4-core i7 with 16 gigs of RAM. So it can do stuff. And then I have this other machine that's not as nice that I can just let sit and do its thing for days if I need to. But it became evident to me that I need to look at my hub-by-hub base and not look at it from a global standpoint. Then do exact matches to try to parse the files down to the different vocabularies, and then match the terms that are double dashed and limited. So Library of Congress has a method, it dates back to the 60s and actually previous before that, where they'll have a subject term and then 2 dashes and another subject term, and maybe they'll continue that on. Usually 3, but sometimes you can get 7 different terms. And that some of them, if they're used really often, will actually be in the vocabulary, but some of them will not. So they will not get caught in that sort of thing, so you need to do a process to check that. And then, of course, maybe I should have a more professional term, but we call it mystery leftovers of what was left to try to get. And that was using things like fuzzy matching and manual inspection to see what could be changed in the first ones to try to have tweak the performance of it. So originally, Spark was a relatively new thing for me, so the idea was to get out of PySpark as soon as possible and then start using tools I was familiar with. And so originally I was using PySpark, and then I needed Apache Genna in order to parse the controlled vocabularies, and I was using Python and R and various bash scripts that I was familiar with. So I was having a good time with rep and sed a lot. But unfortunately, for me it was fine, but it needed to be repeatable was the important part. And they live in Apache Spark. And so I needed to change my method a little bit. I'm just going to head over. This is still a work in progress of changing things over, but it's mostly there now. So I split it up, and anybody that's done any kind of data science will notice these terms. I was not creative. So obtain. So need to obtain the different vocabularies and the data set I'm looking at, scrub them, try to clean them, and then do some kind of exploration. So the first 3 steps of what's considered to be data science. And how many people here have used Jupyter Notebooks or would be interested in data science? We have one, okay. So I didn't know, I wanted to gauge on how much I would want to go into it. I think the interesting thing was in scrubbing the files, just in case somebody is interested in, is the Library of Congress nav file. When parsing it, you'll get some error messages, just in case somebody ends up doing this at some point. And I think it had to do with it times out. And so every time it timed out, I would get a bit flip. And so I would have, in this URI, it's supposed to say names, but instead it says NA and then a closing curly brace ES. And so I need to go in and change those in the document. And so that's I just wanted to mention that just in case somebody falls into that same sort of pitfall. And that might be only with the NT file setup. And also it might only have been with that data set in particular. I was chatting with somebody with OCLC about that, and since it's an old data set, it's low priority. I've yet to check a new one to see if that's any different. So, and then I'll move over to just to show a little bit about what it is. Jupyter Notebooks is really nice for data science because what it allows you to do, and I'll pull down, this is actually just ArtStore's their hub. It allows you to put the code in, and then you can get the output right there in line, so you're not looking at different windows. So anybody's taking the statistics course and like using R Studio, and you have the multiple windows. This is nice in a way because I wanted to know how many of the total subject counts that are not null, and then it just gives me the output right there. So I think the interesting thing I wanted to talk about, and please don't mind my scrolling here, is the I did the same thing for the hubs, like the number of subject terms. So if they had 0 subject terms, and we're looking at 21,000 of their items didn't have a subject term at all. But then you have that curve, you can start to see the long tail, that you had 65,500 had at least one term, exactly, and then 2 for 8,000, and it sort of moves on down. And there's one other, the one thing that's bad about this is I've had to have a way to compress looking at all this beautiful code that I spent time doing, so you can get the results. You can of course save them off to an auth file and have a really nice thing for presentation. So, but this is useful for the team at DPLA because then they can see what I've done and take the parts that save them time. They can just cut them out and then paste them into their normal process that they do things. This is the direct comparison of the different, for just theirs. You can see that they, a lot of Library of Congress subject headings did a direct match of 120,000 out of the original 279,000 items. So not quite half. And then also the more important to them is the one of the distinct terms. So they, for that one, even though there's 120,000 instances of that term, there's actually only distinct of the 3,000. So they can try to get the most, bang for their dollar. I think there was one other item here. So, and then the other idea was the complex terms, and to be able to find out how many of those are, and then there's a later step where they break them apart and find the matches to them. And it usually, I'd say maybe at least a third of the items on each one of them. If they use Library of Congress headings, if they broke them apart, they would find a match. It helps to also convert it to fast, so if everything's individual and not a large chunk. So moving a little bit further, actually one other thing I wanted to say about the DPLA's data set was the set I had when they made a capture was in the middle of ingest for one of their providers, and so actually the numbers I have with that data set are a very conservative estimate. There might actually be more subject headings, so that original 2/3 having a subject heading might be actually a little bit more. It might match previous estimates. So Wikidata, for those who are familiar with it, it's a collaborative multilingual continuous semantic database. It was originally conceptually created for the Wikimedia Foundation. The English Wikipedia was seen as the main one, and then the other Wikipedias were considered to be children of the parent. It's like how it was conceptually seen as, but they wanted to be more equal across the board, and so they pulled a lot of the data elements out of that and put it in its own projects called Wikidata. And so when you look at the sidebar info boxes on the English Wikipedia or any of the Wikipedias, there's been moving over to where that information is being actually queried and pulled from Wikidata itself. So then you can update in one place and then have all of them updated. So that becomes really important, especially if you're like looking at some like population of the country or some other information like that. It's easy to update everything. It decreases bot traffic as well, which is nice because then humans, when they look at the talk pages, don't say, oh, the bots have this, I don't need to edit it anymore. Instead, they're just seeing humans talking to each other. So it encourages participation. It's just been around for a few years, since 2012. And it's interesting, especially for the DPLA, because it's web-based. So it allows, and it's open source and free to use, so they can pull information. So if you're looking up particular information about something, they can enrich the results with further information from, all the information that's within the Wikimedia Foundation's universe. So just a little bit more about how big this is. They have more than, these are September 2018 statistics. There was 50,000 contributors to Wikidata, with what they consider an active database doing at least 5 edits a month, being 19,000 contributors. And then at that point in time, there's more than 50 million items. I think it's definitely a few more than that now. A little bit just about what the structure of their items are. They have Wikidata, there's 2 main concepts. One is item, and so that's representing a topic, a concept, or an object. And then they have properties, and that's a category of data for that object. And I think this is much easier to see through an example. So here we're looking at Grumpy Cat. He has a Wikipedia page, so it's important. Oh, I can't go in any farther because otherwise it'll change the way the view is. So you end up having a name, official name for it, Grumpy Cat, and then everybody gets an ID number. Obviously, items should start with Q, so they have Q in their set of numbers. You have the language, and they've been projects have been working to have them in at least 5 languages, if not more. This is just showing a few of them. I'm primarily an English speaker, so that's why mine's set up as that way. He's also known as tartar sauce. It's also an important thing. They have the links to all the Wikipedia pages. But the more impressive thing is the statements, which are these are properties. So it's an instance of a house cat, and it's important if we can have a reference to it. And that clicks in the link here. They have it, the URL is grumpycats.com/about to explain that, yes, this is indeed a cat. And the other thing that's interesting for the DPLA is the linking of images, because they're currently in the process of talking. We'll see where it goes, of maybe providing some photos. So this part also becomes important, especially if they're linking their collections are, their metadata records with what Wikidata has, and have a link between the two. So this course goes on, it scrolls for quite a while. If you want to know more about Grumpy Cat, you can look that up. So I don't want to belabor that point. I could stare at it all day. The cat's on Wikipedia. So the list of properties is also an interesting thing. They made some of the this scrolls on for a while, but they've made life easier to a certain extent. It used to be a little bit more difficult. You had to query using Sparkle queries to find out how many items used a certain label. Now they nicely handle at the end. They just tell you, the head of government, there's 19,744 records that have that at this moment. I believe this page refreshes every time, daily, if not every time you click on it. So that makes life a little bit easier. I just give a general idea of how the structure is. So for this project and just thinking of libraries, I was interested in what kind of links, what kind of properties are there for the different kind of controlled vocabularies. And I just focused on the ones that I was looking at for DPLA, because this might be a good way for them to have a crosswalk, to be able to pull the different vocabularies, assign the URIs from those controlled vocabularies. So if they're using a Library of Congress, have their item ID attached to that, and then have it query Wikidata to do a match between them, is one concept that they're exploring. So, interesting enough, and this was a bit of a surprise, somebody had already created not one, but two DPLA IDs, properties within Wikidata, and they're not used that much. This one has 17 objects for any of the books, paintings, or films. So these are actual items that you link to from Wikidata going to the DPLA, which then actually links to the institution that's providing the actual digital item. And it's an interesting collection of items that they have. There's not necessarily a cohesive collection per se. It just seems to be a few items here and there. And then the other one, which was subject headings, which also was interesting. So this became maybe more of a viable option because somebody's already created it, and so that just encourages people to want to make it much more complete. So it might ultimately for DPLA to have their own in-house subject heading crosswalk and set up their own controlled vocabulary. Of course, that's time and resources, and so whether they do that or not is a big if. But this is the current. I actually re-looked them up last night. These are all the item properties they have, and as you can see, it's a bit over the place. There's a horse, the book Moby Dick. There's some cultural references, Jewish people, African American newspapers, some landmarks. The Unisphere is a big sculpture, Newkirk Plaza. I think I skipped something over here. Oh, Bringmanton Line, if you're a fan of taking public transportation. And then a few famous people in history. So it's definitely room for growth if it's the way they want to choose. The nice thing about it is, since it is publicly editable, then if the cultural institutions would like to, this big if, help and want to have their resources discoverable through the Wikimedia universe, this might actually end up being a viable option. The Library of Congress, they have 3 different IDs. One is the authority ID, and from my looking at it, it is the combination of the LCSH and the LCNAT. and they currently have 860,000 items linked to that property, which is a little short of my estimates of around 10 million. But so it's not complete, but they might be the ones that they need. So that's the next question to ask. They also have one for book properties, and then also the other control vocabulary that was interesting, which was the thesaurus for graphic materials. That one they have only currently 608 items in Wikidata, and the complete collection is off 7,000. So definitely would need to be some group activity to happen in order to make it a completely viable option. And Getty is a similar boat, around 18,000 for the AAT, or Architectural Thesaurus, where around it's a little shy of 400,000 terms into that. It's sort of the same story. These are the other two ones I have not looked at as much from Getty, but they're also ones that may become important for the DPLA. And this is a little bit more newly appeared, was FAST, and it's relatively new, and it's actually growing pretty quickly as far as linking property. So they have many terms for their setup, but right now they're around 290,000. They have a ways to go, but it's probably not too far in the future. So the next steps for me as far as this project, because this was a fellowship through the Drexel University, which I want to say thank you to, and their program Weeds for NDP. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit late on my presentation for the sign up for this coming up year. I think it might be the third year, so if you're interested in digital libraries, they had multiple institutions, it wasn't just DPLA involved. It was a great experience. And then I also want to thank Michael and Gretchen they were my mentors. They were very helpful. I had like weekly meetings with them to learn about how they did their work at the DPLA, how to make things accessible. They're wonderful people, so I want to make sure I say that. And I guess I'll just open it up for questions. I did leave the last one.
So I have questions. So maybe I also have similar research with you. I also done text mining, but in my case, I was using the library collection in the graduate thesis, and I've also submitted the paper. And there are, there's a revision that I will need to have at least the text mining. They said that text mining is not only about numbers, so I have to do another analysis. So what can you suggest of kinds of analysis that is not related to
because I am working, I'm in the drafting stage of a paper and share with my mentors. They have new numbers, which is also like new data set that just came out. It's a cleaner data set, so I'm going to be rerunning all these things, which is also a good point to tweak it. I think the interesting part, there was a paper several years ago by Zavalina at the University of Texas, her and some co-authors. They did analysis on the DPLA site. There was, I think, only around 8 million records at that time, opposed to over 20 million records they have now. And in their paper, their analysis was whether there was a subject heading present or not. And then they were just doing aggregates of looking at unique subject headings and ones that only appeared a couple of times, opposed to ones that happen often. And so for me, what you're talking about is how do I differentiate what I'm doing? Part of it was looking at the actual vocabulary to try to match. But more importantly, I think the underlying thing that's interesting, which I don't really go into it as much here, is the cataloging practices of the various institutions. Because although this is one giant collection, there are actually records being pulled directly from all 42 of these, well, hubs. Some of them are direct institutions themselves, like say the Library of Congress. But then some of them are actually just collections. They're everything in the state, like the Sunshine it's all Florida libraries and institutions that are providing information. And like the one thing that I noticed was the using of individual names that were just mentioned. So that's an interesting value point that although, you know, if you're a person like me that likes to have a complete set, have everything accounted for, it allows the understanding that it will never be that, you know, because those people, unless they make their own control vocabulary, those people in particular that were participating in that event. And that was the most extreme example, having 1,300 subject headings, but there was many other ones like that. So I think for the papers having a talk about what are the catalog and local practices and why are they doing it, and it's the answer, it can be multiple things, but one of them being that they're looking at that individual collection, especially archives. The way they approach an item is how can they best serve that particular collection, and then maybe as a secondary, often as a secondary I should say, is how does it fit in with their greater set of items that they archive for you to find items. So if there's a subject term that really serves that one particular collection, they'll choose that one. It'd be more specific because that's important for them to help out to find items within it. So like let's say a set of photos, and you know they may be all about a university, so the subject heading university might not help with their university photos. So you might want to have it athletics, but then athletics might not be a good enough term, so there might be more specific ones. I know that's more of a broad one, and the Library of Congress probably can handle that, but depending on the institution, maybe they might have some terms that are different. So you get back to your question, I think the actual real interesting thing, you know, it's always consider about a time, and I know for them, they're not as worried about it. The really interesting stuff probably are these secondary vocabularies that they're using. They're very specific to collections. Why are they needed, opposed to something more general, and how does that affect a user typing terms in? If they don't know that specific term, are they able to even find it within the system? So I think that's a more practical result opposed to just saying, you know, 2/3 of these things have a subject heading. Well, that sounds nice, but what does it actually mean for the end user? And also, what does it mean for the people working with collections, trying to make them findable, you know, and having something that's repeatable type of process. That's the important part. So, okay. I got to your question, it's unclear, I think, so.
The other would be like, because I'm working on the language, the Indonesian language, so it also could be a problem. I mean, so what do you see in the DPLA? Is there any other language used or other than English that create problems?
That's actually a good question. There are some Spanish heritage, Spanish language items in there, and that these vocabularies might not be catching. Most of them, I believe, have English also as well in those collections. I haven't dived into that part. That's actually a really good point about the different languages. I think if this was international, it would have a greater impact. But since this is just the United States, and although we don't have an official language, English is usually the most common one. But you have a good point. There are some instances of Spanish names that I saw. That was the most time-consuming part was the mystery leftovers. Is taking a look at them. As much as I like to try to have a computer do stuff and do fuzzy matching and do cluster analysis and stuff like that, it only takes you so far. You have to make a list. And there's just no way around it. And for a while, TPLA had a full-time metadata person who, that's what they did, is they looked at quality of records and do visual inspections. And it's very costly, and it's great when you have a budget. You can do that, to have humans do it. But sometimes that's not, in the library world, that's a common story. You can see like cataloging departments slow or shrink. People are great, but they're also kind of expensive. And I like to sleep, computers don't. So that's the other thing. They're trying to work towards more automated stuff. That's definitely their goal. It makes sense for them. They have a small staff. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, okay, because I'm thinking like, mine also have so much problem with the use of mixed language, sometimes use English, sometimes use Indonesians. So I have to record all of this stuff. Is there any like, maybe you can share the easier part, easier things to do for this kind of problems?
The problems I have that is interesting is, I touched on briefly the computer-generated issues, where like bit flip will happen, maybe one character will change, like M's to curly braces and stuff like that. The other one, which is interesting, in ACM had this problem, has had maybe they've corrected it, in their titles. And I don't know for you if it's a similar instance, if there's a digitalization that happens at some point. Carriage returns get removed. So if you have a title that's really long, like my title was large, it took several things out, OCR will take that title and will get rid of the carriage return and we'll just butt words together. And so like mine, let's see if I can, there's no, I want the home button to work. That's, you know. So mine, I have inna would be a word, and aggregated digital would be another word. And a lot of times they use title search, which is important. And unless you're in the specialization of aggregated digital, that's one word, that might, those digital library won't show up with their issue. And sometimes in working with the files, if that's an joy to have for a couple hours to realize that you did this work and you move on down and you realize that I didn't code something quite right and I did that. It's an easy mistake to do. If what you're doing might with like large sets of text. To be wary of that pitfall, that depending on how you extract the data, you might end up doing that. Apache was nice, but for me to be able to look at each individual subject heading instead of being a long list, I broke them out, exploded them, and then flattened them, so that way there would be like, basically, if you looked at them as CSV file, each line had a term on it, and it's easy to just not put in a little bit of code and you can get words that are smashed together or like other weirdness like that. Like all the terms had like a opening bracket and a closing bracket, and if I don't have things correctly, sometimes I'll have these weird orphans where they'll have an opening bracket but never have a closing bracket for that term. And the method I'm using, it doesn't catch that until I get to the end and say fuzzy match, and it says, oh wait, these are things really close, they just have a bracket, so I need to code in other steps along the way. So it's it can be a challenge. It's I'd heard before this project I hadn't done something at this large scale as far as like data mining or like any kind of matching and looking at large amount of records. And they said the scrub stage or the cleanup takes the most amount of time, and there's an error that points back to it and says you're going to revisit this constantly and at certain stages, and I found that to be very true for me. Part of it might be beginner's luck, but I think that's the norm actually. So for me, that's the time-consuming thing. It's just preparing the stuff to actually get the results you need, and really the importance of looking at what's left and seeing what is there. Is it just names of people? For in my instance that aren't not going to match to something, or is there something that's odd that's happening?
So what is the next step for you?
In this project itself? Yes, because this fellowship supposed to be for just the summer, but there was a couple of us that said, I like hanging out with these people, and they said free labor's nice, and so I'm one of them. But for me, is it's pretty much there as the GitHub repository. It's been recoded into PySpark. It's lost as much any other kind of things, that tools that I knew, and just use as quick as possible to get results to find out what's happening. So that way for them, they can take chunks they want, they can translate it in Scala if they want for their reports. So that part is pretty much capsuled. The big thing is I feel that there's an interesting article about the various institutional practices and how the finding results and when you're querying DPLA's database and return results you get. So that's the stage on that, and then at some point in time, I believe I'll be excluded from their Slack conversations, and I won't know anything more about what's happening with them. So that's the next step for this particular project. For me, the part that I'm interested in long term is the Wikidata coverage and linking, say, a very large institution such as collections, the Union Catalog like DPLA has, connected to the Wikimedia universe, and how does that relate? Usefulness of enriching results for users, and just necessarily the working groups involved in the practices for maintaining quality.
So one thing you need to think about is, so what are the research questions?
The research questions. One is what is the coverage of subject headings within the catalog? And then the second question is what's the percentage of items, the subject terms that are already there, that actually might correlate to a controlled vocabulary that would then have potentially be crosswalked to other vocabularies. Because a lot of vocabularies have built into theirs crosswalks. The most notable one between OCLC's FAST and Library Congress. But Getty has that as well, some other vocabularies. And those are the two main questions that, and then there's some more difficult questions that could be there. I'm trying to decide how much time I want to spend at this stage for this item, because it could be, this is, I knew in the first meeting that this was a large project, and actually the scope was a little bit larger than originally had, and I think it's important. Lesson that I keep relearning is how to scope a project. Where do you consider the stopping point for that part of the project and then continue it on, opposed to thinking of something as one large whole. So for the paper, I'm thinking those two items are important, and the possibility of talking about having a linked, having an interlink between the vocabularies. But as I was discussing, the really interesting stuff is the individual cataloging practices, but I feel that might actually be a separate article and project to come after that. Any other questions?
I have a slight curiosity.
Okay.
I'm not knowledgeable about the topic, but I was wondering that if you could clarify, when you update a wiki from the Wikidata,
Yes.
does it update across languages?
Potentially, yes.
Wow.
So if, to go to my example, do I still have it? I still have it opened up. So Grumpy Cat, if we look, this is the photo that she used in the information box. This is a great test. I haven't done this, so we can see there's multiple languages. I know English should have it. So we'll go to English. There's the photo there on the corner. So English is fine. But let's say, I'll just pick another one. And yep, there it is, the same information, but it's been translated. So, that's text being So I don't know how to read that, but I'm assuming that's exactly what it is.
It is.
But let's double check. So, do I have, if I looked at it, yeah, it would be less likely so. And then let's go to something that I've only transliterated, so I don't actually know how to speak any of it at all. Here's Grumpy's cat's photo again, and then the information. You can see some of them have been in English, and so it has some of the same exact
I see, yeah.
years active, and occupation, because this cat does have an occupation, makes money. It has parents, human parents, I believe is what the list is actually. So if I logged in and made an edit here, so like somewhere that maybe there was another piece of information that would be important. I believe she's still alive, so but if there was a death occurred, actually I looked up another internet cat that died. It has that, and also says medical problems about Wikimedia is an interesting universe of different groups of people that work on these projects, and this deaths is something people update really fast, especially with humans. Not so much with internet celebrity cats, but that's what I like. So yes, any of this data that's here, if they've coded on the Wikipedia site, that's the thing they've been working on. That info box and any other information, they need to have it linked. But that's ultimately their goal, is to have a link to this information to those exact Wikipedias. If they're listed here, most likely it has a link to it, but at one point in time, especially in the early, if it's a brand new item, it might not. They might link that there is a page, but that they might not have an info box. And if they do have an info box, it might not actually have been linked to it at that point in time.
So if it's linked, then it should.
Link, it most likely will.
Most likely.
Yes, so it's always continuously running, continuously being updated. So it's always changing. So you might. That's why I was like, well, click to see. There's a possibility that if maybe one of those languages they just added Grumpy Cat, it might not actually link and show that information. But if they have a link in that, if I updated something here, we would see relatively instantaneous change between it. It's very helpful for them. The big thing being removing bot traffic from Wikipedia pages. So that way humans can talk to each other as opposed to talking to machines. Which is important for morale, encouraging people to participate. The other thing, which I don't know if this one has, I remember also why I picked this one, is if I scroll down, Grumpy Cat has identifiers. It actually has a VOF ID and a Library of Congress Authority file. So I don't know, I guess Grumpy Cat had a book, right? And so Grumpy Cat had a book, so Grumpy Cat's an author, and so now it has a Library of Congress Authority file ID, and that controlled vocabulary is linked. Actually, I should say VOF is linked to the Library of Congress. So if it's in the Library of Congress, they have a cycle where they go and do updates, and so then at some point there'll be a VOF ID as well attaching to it. So and Grumpy Cat had a movie. So that's why the IMDb link as well. That helps with it if you think, the reason why I'm talking about this point, the setup of these IDs, at the bottom of Wikipedia articles, you'll have to have external links to other sources, and sometimes those are being coded to where you can click. And so if you add, say if I found, say DPLA had a Grumpy, they don't, but if they had a Grumpy Cat item in their collection, and DPLA would have a subject heading for it, I could add that in there, and then it would be a way for somebody to click on a link and look at the collection. Well, actually look at the record that DPLA has, which then would go into a collection. space hubs.